We're living, as we all know, in a time of profound crisis. Rising polarization, war, environmental crises. Many of us want to do something. We care deeply, but the challenges just feel too big. It's not that we're missing heart or hope. It's not that we don't care. It's that we're looking for a vision of how ordinary people, like all of us, can respond to what's going on. And that's where Peace Heroes and these stories come in. They are guides who have found ways to respond with courage, creativity, and hope. They give us a roadmap that maybe we can follow, even in our day-to-day lives. Welcome to We Are Peace Heroes. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Ellie.
And we are very excited today to be telling you another story of another peace hero. And today we are going to go to Australia. There are so many incredible peace heroes from Australia, specifically those working for the rights of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups of that country. And one of our favorites is the story of Mum Sheryl. Mum Sheryl was an Indigenous Australian woman, and her story is remarkable because she experienced such immense suffering and she transformed it into such radical compassion. I mean, she has an incredible story about how truly the most ordinary people, even in the most difficult situations, can change the world through very simple but amazing and courageous acts of love. So, Ellie, why are we even telling this story? Does it have any relevance to any of us today?
Well, you know that you and I believe all our stories are relevant to us today, but in Mum Sheryl's case, I think kind of the main themes that come out is just the power of compassion. Her story shows how compassion can be like a world-changing force. And I think that that is something that we can all repeatedly hear and learn from.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is just how in the midst, and this is a theme that comes up over and over again with us, but in the midst of feeling really, really helpless, there's always something that you can actually do. There's always a way to take action. And I think that her story really brings us out in a very strong way because she had every reason to be one of the most helpless people in the world. So these are the two main themes that we're going to focus on today. But before we do that, let's get a little bit into the background of the story, Kirsten, so you can set the stage for us before we get into Mum Sheryl's life.
Sure. Before we begin, brief note on language, which is always really important. Australia is made up of many different and distinct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, and each has their own culture and language and beliefs and so on. Mum Sheryl, whose story we are telling today, she comes from the Wiradjuri people, which is an Aboriginal group. So we'll mostly be referring to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, but we wanted to acknowledge this isn't including the Torres Strait Islander groups who are also part of the First Nations of Australia. So the background to this story, unfortunately, is the age-old and horrible story of colonialism in many parts of the world. Australia had a huge amount of Indigenous peoples, and in the late 1700s, there were British colonialists who came, and most of you know the story of how that unfolds, just the immense dehumanization, violence, horrible treatment of the Indigenous peoples of that place. And so, of course, after a couple hundred years, not only had untold number of Indigenous peoples been killed or died from viruses that came with the settlers, but there was simply a system in place where, generally speaking, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples had no power. They couldn't vote. They had no access to systems. They were completely second-class citizens in that country. So that gives you a very general background. I expect many of us can fill in the blanks. So Ellie, tell us about Mum Sheryl's life.
Okay, so Mum Sheryl, whose name is actually Colleen Shirley Perry, she was born in 1924 in New South Wales in Australia, and she was born on in a mission station, which is essentially like a reserve for Indigenous people. And being born on a reserve essentially marked her life as one of hardship from the moment she arrived on this earth. It was kind of like a dead-end life for many of the Indigenous peoples, being born into circumstances that just don't open up the door to any kind of hopeful future. She was really close to her grandfather growing up, and when he was kicked out of the mission when she was a child, she went and lived with him under a bridge just to kind of show the extent of the poverty and the homelessness that she experienced as a child. So poverty accompanied her through her whole life, beginning with her childhood and on into adulthood. And when she was 16, she got married, moved to Sydney, and the rest of her story takes place in Sydney that we'll get to. But I'm going to go back first to her childhood and just say that the hardships that she experienced were in many ways reflective of hardships that many Indigenous peoples were experiencing in Australia at the time. She was born into, like Kirsten said, a history filled with pain and suffering, a history of poverty, not just a history, but a reality of poverty, discrimination, poor health, little hope. And I think it's important to mention that she was born exactly 100 years after a devastating massacre of her tribe at the hands of the Australian Army. So she was born into generational trauma, which is something that I think we're becoming more aware of in terms of how it really affects people today, just what is passed on from generation to generation. And that was very much part of her inheritance, was this massacre of her people, that though she didn't experience it, it lived in her in her consciousness and her subconsciousness. And so I think that's important to mention.
Yeah, definitely. And just to add in even more specifics, you've got all this really broad, systemic inequality and suffering and context to where she's living. And then, of course, just the really personal, specific additional challenges that she faced. I mean, this is a girl who, from the time she was a young child, suffered from epilepsy. And the thing that strikes me when we talk about Mum Sheryl and her epilepsy is it was even then a very treatable condition. But like we keep saying, people like Mum Sheryl had no access to medical care. And so she could not even receive the health care for her epilepsy. And that caused, of course, I believe she never went to school. Is that right?
Yeah, no, she was only semi-literate for most of her life.
Yeah, so she never was able to go to school. And her epilepsy continued to be a huge obstacle throughout her whole life for so many reasons. And it's like all of the big systemic and generational and huge challenges that are, feel almost insurmountable. And then to just add on some of these very personal additional challenges, it's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely. And I think that is why the words that her grandfather spoke to her are so poignant. Because when she was young, he said to her, and I quote, this is something that she would later recall. He said, "Colleen, first you've got to love yourself, and then you can spread it around." And for him to say that to this child who has epilepsy, who's being excluded from social life because of her epilepsy, she can't go to school, she can't work. And her grandfather recognized, you need to learn to love yourself. Don't let the way the world treats you inform how you think about yourself and how you treat yourself. So I think that was really a beautiful and wise piece of advice that he gave her. And it would stay with her for the rest of her life. So like you said, she had epilepsy, which was treatable, but in her case, she didn't have the medication to keep it under control, and her epilepsy cost her education. It cost her steady employment, and in the most tragic way possible, it also cost her children. So she actually lost her first child in childbirth because she had an epileptic fit during childbirth. And then shortly after, she gave birth to a second daughter, Beatrice. But because of her epileptic fits, she was unable to care for her daughter. And when her daughter was 3, she had to send her daughter to her paternal grandparents to raise the child because she didn't have the capacity to raise her with her disease. And like you said, it's so tragic because it was treatable. Look how much she lost because of inadequate health care, and being part of a system that just didn't provide for her. Like I said earlier, poverty defined her life. And maybe one of the more devastating manifestations of that was when Mum Sheryl's older brother resorted to petty theft because he was trying to make some easy money. He was caught, he was imprisoned, and this was not out of the ordinary for so many Aboriginal men who, in desperation, they turned to a life of crime. So far, we've set the stage of like all the things that have been taken away from her, all the things that she's lost, all the hardships. But it's at this point where we start to see the ways in which Mum Sheryl gives back. And what's really amazing about her story, if you pay attention, is just this incredible parallel between the things that she lost and the things that she gave back. So when her brother was imprisoned, she went to visit him in prison. And one thing she realized was that so many of the prisoners there had nobody visiting them. And there's I was reading someone who was eulogizing Mum Sheryl at her death, and he put it in a way that is really striking. He said, the black people in the prison didn't have people visiting them because their families couldn't afford the trip, and the white prisoners didn't have anyone visiting them because their families couldn't afford the embarrassment. And Mum Sheryl sees this. She sees all these lonely people, not just her brother, and so she starts to visit the other prisoners. And it's actually at this point that she gets the nickname Mum Sheryl, which is, Mother Shirley. At the prisons, it's the prisoners who started to name her that because she became to them like a mother. She was the one family member, as it were, who was coming to visit to try to kind of break their loneliness, their solitude, and show them that they were still valued and remembered, not forgotten. This was her first act of giving back, visiting sometimes up to 250 prisoners, I think, whenever she would go visit her brother. By this time, Mum Sheryl is living in Sydney. And so it doesn't take long for her compassion to extend beyond the prison walls. So, Kirsten, what was South Sydney like where she was living?
You've got this urban environment where, of course, so many of the Indigenous peoples from around Australia have been coming to the city. But as Mum Sheryl said, there was so little to be shared between so many. And of course, then you just add all of the harshness of the poverty and the discrimination. I mean, there's so many factors going on here. And of course, that eventually will lead to, violence and self-harm and unemployment and drug abuse and crime. Like it's just part of what unfolds in this kind of unjust and poverty-stricken situation. And so there's so much hopelessness and despair. And of course, Mum Sheryl sees it. Like she sees it in the prison when she's visiting her brother and all the prisoners there. But being this remarkable human, her compassion just extends everywhere. And so at this point, it's almost like I'm afraid to even start, listing all the things that Mum Sheryl did, because I'm pretty sure we'll miss something. Like it's unbelievable how she started to just simply act like, extend this compassion to all the suffering around her. She wouldn't say no to anyone. So she for sure had this incredible spot in her heart for orphaned and abandoned children. And she just began taking care of them as much as she was able. She would find shelter. She would bring people into her own home. I know she had at least 60 foster children in her care directly, but she also, countless others who considered her, the only mother figure they had. So she cared very much for all of the abandoned children. Unfortunately, there were so many at that time in Sydney. And then, the youth who were also delinquent at the time, and the alcoholics and the drug addicts. Like it's always, whenever people talk about Mum Sheryl, they're like, she especially cared for the children, the youth, the prisoners, the alcoholics, the drug addicts. And it's just like, how, like what? It was everyone who was suffering. She just cared so much. And she put that compassion into action. I know someone has called her like the one woman welfare system or something of Sydney and even beyond Sydney. But she just began doing everything she could to stand up for and walk alongside these people. So she would find shelter, she would find food, she would welcome people who had just come into the city. She was always not only expressing, compassion and caring for, but then taking the next step. She would then stand up and she started representing people in courts. And anytime someone had to appear in the children's court, minors or drug addicts or whatever it was, she would be the one who would go and stand up on their behalf. And it's amazing. She became such a constant in the court system. And the court system, which of course is, the system that has taken so much from her and her people. This is not a system that is generally feeling much compassion towards Mum Sheryl or the Indigenous peoples, but she was so consistent and strong and compassionate and admirable, I think, that even that judicial system started to recognize and admire her. So that anytime that, the normal response would be to put this young person, for example, into an institution, they would instead just put them directly into Mum Sheryl's care. Like even the court system of Sydney recognized that this woman was doing something remarkable and they trusted her. And she just accepted them. She just kept accepting children and young people and so on.
Just to add a little image to what you're just describing, several years ago, we created a mini magazine about Mum Sheryl, and we had a friend of yours, an artist, do our front cover of the magazine. And what we asked her to do, we gave her this sentence. This is a quote from someone. I think it's Father Kennedy. He eulogized her when she died. And he said, here was this extraordinarily defiant woman giving warning that if anyone tried to crush the little ones, they'd have her and her handbag to contend with. And you and I both loved that image because it just showed what an ordinary woman she was. I mean, she was just a woman with a handbag out to defend the powerless, the children, the alcohol, like all the people who needed. It was just her and her handbag. And so that was the picture that Sandy drew for us of like Mum Sheryl with her handbag. But I love that image just because of how normal she was in terms of just just a woman doing all that she could do without fear of the system, but with a whole lot of compassion that even broke through the system that was there to cripple her and so many others.
What's the other thing that we didn't even talk about is not only all of these things we've already mentioned and just the daily difficult acts of compassion and care. Remembering here, of course, that here's this woman who has never gone to school. She's barely literate. Beyond all of that daily work she was doing, she actually went on to establish so many groups or bodies that to help like the wider community. I have a list here. Like she helped establish the Aboriginal Legal Service in 1971, the Aboriginal Medical Service in 1972, the Aboriginal Black Theatre, which I just love, is this little like suddenly the art and theater comes in, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, the Aboriginal Children's Service, the Aboriginal Housing Company, and the Detoxification Center. What? I mean, this woman was doing so much to, again, she was kind of saying the system isn't doing it for us. The government is not helping us. And so we will establish and create these systems to help care for the vulnerable among us. And many of the organizations that she put in place are still in existence today. She really changed the landscape of that country.
Absolutely, in big and small ways. I just wanted to point out, and I think that this is really important, and we kind of missed this at the beginning, but when Mum Sheryl was younger, when she was a child, she would later say she remembers every act of kindness. Anytime someone was good to her, especially in her epileptic fits, people who stepped in to care for her and just showed compassion towards her, that left such a mark on her. And she understood deeply from a personal level what it means for someone to look on you, to be kind to you, to have compassion, to help you. And she lived the rest of her life feeling this gratitude, this indebtedness to those people who had helped her. And that's why she wanted to give back. She knew what it felt like personally. And she wanted to be that person to others because of her own suffering. So it wasn't like she was coming from the outside, this privileged person who can step in and make a difference. She was doing what she was doing out of her own experience of suffering that had turned into compassion. And actually, the word for compassion, the actual word means suffering with, right? So it was her experience of suffering that enabled her to suffer with other people and help them in the ways that she was helped by acts of kindness when she was a child.
And maybe this is a good time to go back to her grandfather, who was so influential in her life. Ellie, can you tell us about him and especially his quote about the bread? I think that was so significant.
Yeah, so when Mum Sheryl was a child, her grandfather told her how wheat growing in the fields, when it's watered by, in the way he would say, is watered by God's good rain, that the wheat first had to be crushed before it can be turned into flour for baking bread. And this is such a great metaphor for Mum Sheryl's life. It illustrates how she took the suffering and hardship of her own life, those crushing experiences, and she turned that suffering into something good and something that could be shared, like sharing her bread, as it were, with everyone around her who was desperately hungry for a better life. And her grandfather also said that, the simple act of eating and sharing our bread means that we're taking part in a miracle. So Mum Sheryl, she had taken her own pain and suffering, and she had turned it into a miracle for others, like the bread that others ate and were sustained by, her love and her compassion. And that's why I said, she kind of became the miracle in other people's lives. So, Kirsten, from here, why don't you tell us some of the awards that were bestowed on Mum Sheryl before she died to show like the extent of her impact in Australia? What were some of those recognitions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so many. I don't know if we even have them all here, but I know that she was awarded a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1975, which is all sorts of levels of ironic and redemptive, as well as the Medal of the Order of Australia. She was named Aboriginal of the Year in 1998, just before she died. She was acknowledged as one of Australia's living treasures by the National Trust. And by the time she did die, I mean, her impact was obviously so well known that even the Australian deputy premier at the time when she died, he said this. He said, Mum Sheryl's enormous compassion and her endless generosity towards all people in need were without equal. She will never be forgotten for her tireless work for justice for the Aboriginal people. So on the one hand, over and over, nobody could deny her immense impact on so many people and on the community and on the situation of the Aboriginal people of that country. And at the same time, the amazing thing about her was just the small and daily acts of compassion. I think she shows the whole breadth of the ways that we, any of us, can make a difference and can heal the brokenness around us. And like you said earlier, I think that there's just this remarkable I don't know if parallel is the right word, this remarkable pattern in her life. And I love it when you say it, Ellie, like when you talk about how much was taken from her and then what she gave back. Can you tell us, like, what are some examples of that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's the obvious one. Her children, she lost her children because of a system that didn't provide the care that she needed to be able to care for her children. So she lost her two children and she became a mother to so many. She gave herself in that way to so many others. She lost her home, her housing. She lived under a bridge as a child. And then she opened up her home and provided housing for so many homeless people when she was in Sydney. She didn't have proper health care, but she stepped into a system and tried to advocate for those who the system wouldn't provide for in all kinds of ways. She created all these different organizations that part of that was to give back to the people what she herself had lacked. And it goes on and on. I mean, all the ways in which life had deprived her in really tragic ways. She gave back to the people exactly what had been taken. Where she was excluded from society. She was excluded from school because of her epilepsy. She was excluded from work, from social interactions. Her mantra then became, I will be open to all. So that exclusion actually, the flip side of that was her openness to receiving absolutely everyone. She never turned anyone away. She never turned a single person away who showed up at her doorstep or when the doors had been closed to her in so many different ways. So those are just a few of the parallels or the kind of like reverse narrative around Mum Sheryl's life.
Wow. Yeah. What an incredible woman. What an incredible woman.
So, Kirsten, going through the story again, re-engaging with this story that you and I know so well, is there any one big idea that stood out to you that maybe you hadn't noticed before, something that really drew your attention?
Yeah. I mean, besides the obvious, I just stand in awe of this woman and how she took action. I mean, there's obviously so many things that really stun and amaze me and convict me about her story. But one thing, we didn't mention this yet, but I hadn't remembered until I looked at her story again, this quote. She said once, Mum Sheryl said this, she said, people are far more comfortable hearing about problems that are too far away for them to be able to do anything about them than hearing about problems in their own backyard. Whew, that one. I mean, I'm hesitant to even talk about it because, of course, what does that mean for each of us? But I think it's so true. Like we can get so caught up in big global problems, which are very valid and important. But there's often so little we can do. What we get caught up in is even just that kind of helplessness and overwhelm. Like there's nothing I can do, but boy, there are a lot of big problems over there. And yet it's so much harder to face the actual suffering, the inequalities, the injustices, the discriminations. I mean, the poverty, even right in our own communities. It's harder. And Mum Sheryl saw that over and over in so many people, and yet she was not willing to ignore what was immediately around her, the person at her doorstep that the rest of us might think is really hard to help, or there's nothing we can do, or it's too much discomfort to reach out to the problems in our own neighborhoods. And yet she just showed us over and over again how important and powerful it really is. So I'll be thinking about that one a long time. How about you, Ellie? Are there things this time in the story that really stood out to you?
Wow. I mean, when you and I were deciding on the Peace Heroes for the podcast, and it was just going through her story again, and both of us were just like, wow. It was like just being reminded what an amazing human being she was. And when we were going through this together, we were both just in awe. Like I think there was even a moment of silence as we were recognizing again what an incredible woman she was. But actually, it was, in preparation for this podcast, I was looking at some of the pictures that we have of her. And there's this really beautiful picture of Mum Sheryl with these kids all standing next to her. And I think it's 3 or 4 kids, and they're all looking up at her. And there's just so much joy in that picture. Like these kids looking up at her, they all have huge smiles on their faces. She's smiling back down at them. And that picture really just kind of cemented itself in my mind, like of just a picture of how, in spite of all the hardship, in spite of all this, here we're painting such a bleak picture of, life for Indigenous peoples in Australia, South Sydney. And yet in the midst of all of that she didn't allow her experiences to turn her or the kids around her or the people around her into victims where there's no joy in life. Like she actually brought joy back into the lives of these kids and these people. And that picture just really hit me, just seeing those smiling kids, this abundance of joy, because here's someone who's loving them. And in that moment, they are safe, they are seen, they are known. And how precious and valuable it is to continue to bring that kind of joy into hard and difficult spaces. So I don't know, that really struck me this time around.
Thanks for sharing that. That's beautiful. So at the end, we often try to end with a, so what? Like, what can we do? We hear this amazing story. It feels maybe a little bit daunting to me, at least. Like, there's no way I can live up to Mum Sheryl and just the remarkable things she did. And yet the point of it is to show us that actually, in the face of what feels so often overwhelming, there's such a helplessness, I think, that so many of us are feeling exactly when we do focus on every single big global problem. and of course, Mum Sheryl, what she would want us to take from her story is not the helplessness, but this idea that we can do one small thing. Like you once said, Mum Sheryl will be remembered by many. And she has been eulogized as a, quote, great Australian. But perhaps the best and simplest way to honor her memory is to make no distinction among people and extend kindness and compassion to all those whose paths might cross our own. And so that is what I'm going to take with me today, and maybe each of us, as we are crossing paths with many different people in our days and weeks ahead. Can we honor Mum Sheryl by extending kindness and compassion, no matter who they are or the challenges they're facing?
Thank you, Kristen. That's a great call to action. And then just to point out again, Mum Sheryl is one of the stories that we have on our website as a mini magazine. It's free. You can sign up to the website and download it. It's great for kids. It's a great interactive story, even for adults who just want a simple version of the story. So we encourage you to go to our website and download the Mum Sheryl mini magazine.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder, Ellie. Thank you so much for joining us, because we believe that peace isn't just a dream. It's a choice and it's a path. And it starts here with the stories we choose to tell and the actions we choose to take.